At its peak, TVR was producing close to 1,000 hand-built performance cars every year from a single factory in Blackpool, operating without the automation, scale, or corporate infrastructure that defined the modern automotive industry. It was a company that worked on its own terms, building machines that rejected electronic assistance and demanded something most cars had already eliminated: complete control from the driver. From the outside, everything was working. Demand was steady, the brand was growing, and there was no visible crisis threatening its position. It wasn't competing on scale, but it didn't need to. It had carved out its own space, and for a time, it held it. And then, within 2 years, it collapsed. By 2006, production had stopped, the factory had fallen silent. Honda, and a company that had spent decades refining its identity, disappeared from active manufacturing with a speed that caught even industry observers off guard. There was no long decline, no extended warning, no clear moment where the failure became obvious. Which is what makes this story difficult to explain on the surface. Because when a company moves from stability to shutdown this quickly, the collapse doesn't begin at the end. It begins earlier, hidden inside the system, building quietly while everything still appears to be working. And, in TVR's case, that failure was already there, at its peak. So the real question isn't why it collapsed. It's what was already breaking, when everything still looked perfect. Chapter 1. The Illusion of Power. What made TVR difficult to understand was not how it failed, but how long it managed to operate without appearing fragile. Because by the early 2000s, nothing about the company suggested instability. Production was consistent, demand remained steady, and the brand had established a clear identity within a highly competitive market. From the outside, it did not look like a company approaching its limits. It looked like one that had found them and learned how to operate within them. Inside its Blackpool factory, a relatively small workforce was producing close to 1,000 high-performance sports cars each year, not through automation or standardized assembly lines, but through a process built around manual craftsmanship and accumulated experience. Each car was not the result of a fixed system, but of a repeated effort, one that relied on familiarity rather than strict uniformity. To an external observer, this appeared deliberate, even refined. That perception extended into the product itself. TVR's cars rejected many of the features that had become standard across the industry. Minimal electronic assistance, aggressive performance characteristics, and a driving experience that demanded constant attention became defining traits rather than limitations. Customers were not simply buying a car, they were aligning themselves with a philosophy that prioritized intensity over comfort and engagement over predictability. At this stage, the numbers supported the narrative. Production remained stable relative to the company's scale, and demand within its niche market showed no immediate signs of decline. The brand had built a strong presence within the UK and was expanding into export markets, where its reputation as a raw, unconventional manufacturer attracted a specific and committed audience. Everything about the system suggested balance, but that balance depended on a condition that had not yet been tested. Because what looked like stability was not the result of structural strength, it was the result of continuity. The system functioned efficiently because the conditions around it remained consistent. Leadership did not change abruptly, production was not significantly disrupted, and the workforce remained intact, carrying with it the knowledge required to sustain the process. This created a structure that did not need to adapt, it only needed to continue. And as long as nothing interrupted that continuity, the system appeared controlled. Problems could be addressed internally, decisions could be made quickly, and the company could maintain its independence without relying on external frameworks. But this way of operating also meant that the system had very little capacity to absorb pressure. Knowledge was concentrated rather than distributed. Processes were flexible, but not standardized in a way that allowed for easy correction or scaling. There were no deeply layered safeguards designed to stabilize operations if conditions changed. Instead, everything was tightly connected, functioning as a single system rather than a series of independent parts. That kind of structure does not fail in obvious ways. It maintains its shape even as pressure begins to build beneath it. And because that pressure is not immediately visible, Or the system can appear stable long after its limits have begun to form. From the outside, there was no clear indication that anything was approaching failure. The company continued to produce cars, maintain its identity, and operate within a market that valued exactly what it offered. Which is what makes this phase so deceptive in hindsight. Because when most companies begin to fail, the signs tend to accumulate. Decline becomes visible, performance weakens, and the outcome begins to feel predictable. But TVR did not follow that pattern in a way that could be easily observed. It maintained the appearance of control right up until the moment that control could no longer be sustained, and that is where the illusion begins to break. Because if a system appears stable, but depends entirely on conditions that have not been tested under stress, and then its strength is not proven, it is assumed. And once that assumption is challenged, the outcome is no longer determined by how well the system performs under ideal conditions, but by how it responds when those conditions change. Which leads to a more important question than the collapse itself. If everything seemed so controlled, if production was consistent, demand was steady, and the company was operating within its limits, then what kind of weakness could exist inside that system, quietly building without being visible from the outside? Chapter 2. The engine behind the rise. To understand why TVR collapsed, you have to move further back, beyond the years of visible success, and into the logic that built the company in the first place. Because TVR was never designed to function like a conventional automotive manufacturer. From the beginning, it followed a different set of priorities, shaped less by market demands and more by a specific interpretation of what a performance car should be. The company was founded in 1947 by Trevor Wilkinson, and even in its earliest form, the direction was clear. Instead of focusing on scale, comfort, or mass appeal, TVR concentrated on one idea: maximize performance by minimizing everything that was not essential. Lightweight construction, high power output, hidden and a direct mechanical connection between driver and machine became the foundation of its identity. At a time when the broader industry was gradually moving toward refinement, improving ride quality, adding safety systems, and standardizing production, TVR moved in the opposite direction. It stripped away complexity rather than adding to it. The goal was not to make cars easier to drive, but more engaging, more demanding, and, in many cases, less forgiving. This philosophy did more than define the product. It defined the company. By the time the business entered a period of expansion in the 1990s under Peter Wheeler, that identity had already taken root. Wheeler did not attempt to reposition TVR toward mainstream expectations. Instead, he reinforced what made it different. The company began producing more ambitious models, yet pushing further into high-performance territory while maintaining the same underlying approach. Cars like the Cerberus and the Tuscan did not attempt to compete directly with established supercar brands on refinement or technological sophistication. They offered something else: intensity. A driving experience that felt closer to control without assistance, where the absence of electronic intervention was not a drawback, but a defining feature. This positioned TVR in a space that was difficult to replicate. It was not trying to be Ferrari or Lamborghini, it was offering an alternative to them. While those manufacturers balanced performance with increasing levels of control and usability, TVR leaned further into rawness. That distinction attracted a specific type of customer, one that valued experience over predictability and an engagement over comfort. And for a time, that strategy worked. The company built a loyal following that did not require mass market validation. Growth was not driven by scale, but by identity. As long as the cars remained consistent with that philosophy, demand could remain stable within its niche. But this approach also came with consequences that were less visible during the years of expansion. One of the most significant decisions during this period was the move toward developing in-house engines, most notably the Speed 6. On the surface, this represented a logical extension of the company's independence. By controlling its own engine development, TVR could align performance characteristics directly with its design philosophy without relying on external suppliers. It was a move that reinforced the brand's autonomy. But it also introduced a level of technical responsibility that required a different kind of infrastructure, one that the company had not fully developed. Engine design is not just about performance, It requires long-term testing, reliability validation, and systems capable of identifying and correcting faults at scale. As production increased, issues with the Speed 6 engine began to surface. Reliability concerns led to warranty claims, and those claims began to accumulate over time. These were not necessarily catastrophic failures on their own, but they pointed to a deeper challenge. The company's processes were not evolving at the same pace as its ambitions, and this is where the contradiction begins to emerge. The same independence that allowed TVR to innovate quickly also limited its ability to absorb the consequences of that innovation. There was no large external framework to stabilize the system, no extensive network of resources to manage long-term technical risk. Everything remained contained within the same structure. At the same time, the company's culture reinforced this approach. Risk was not avoided. It was accepted, and in some cases, embraced. The brand's identity depended on pushing boundaries, not refining them. That mindset made TVR distinctive, but it also reduced the margin for error. Because when a system is built around intensity, both in its products and its decisions, small problems have a tendency to scale quickly. And yet, during this period, none of this appeared critical from the outside. The cars continued to sell, so the brand continued to grow in recognition, and the company maintained its position as one of the most unique manufacturers in the industry, which is what makes this phase so important to understand. Because the rise of TVR was not just a story of success, it was the construction of a system built on principles that were difficult to adjust once they were fully embedded. Every decision reinforced the same direction: more independence, more intensity, less compromise. But very little of it was designed for stability under pressure. And that raises a question that becomes impossible to ignore as the story moves forward. If the company's identity was built on rejecting the structures that defined the rest of the industry, then what happens when those structures become necessary for survival? Chapter 3: Peak Dominance. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, TVR had reached a point where everything it had built over decades appeared to align. The company was no longer just surviving within its niche, it was defining it. Its lineup during this period, including models like the Cerbera, Tuscan, and later the Sagaris, reinforced a very specific identity. These were not cars designed to appeal broadly. They were aggressive, unconventional, and often demanding to drive. But that was precisely the point. TVR was not trying to expand its audience, it was refining it. And the market responded. Demand within the UK remained strong, supported by a loyal customer base that understood exactly what the brand represented. At the same time, interest from export markets began to grow, extending TVR's reach beyond its domestic foundation, where for a company of its size, this level of visibility was unusual. It was not operating at the scale of global manufacturers, but it was competing with them in terms of recognition within the performance segment. Production, while limited in absolute terms, was consistent relative to the company's structure. Annual output remained within a controlled range, allowing the factory to maintain its handcrafted approach without appearing inefficient. Revenue reached into the tens of millions of pounds, enough to sustain operations while reinforcing the perception of a stable and functioning business model. From the outside, this looked like equilibrium. TVR has achieved something that many small manufacturers fail to reach. It had carved out a distinct position in the market, built a recognizable identity, and maintained enough demand to support continuous production, all without conforming to the structures that larger companies relied on. This is what made it an anomaly. In an industry increasingly defined by scale, standardization, and global integration, TVR remained independent, specialized, and internally driven. It did not depend on large corporate networks, and it did not dilute its identity to appeal to a wider audience. Instead, it operated within a narrow but clearly defined space, where its differences were not a disadvantage, but a competitive edge. For industry observers, this created a compelling narrative. TVR appeared to demonstrate that a small manufacturer could survive and even thrive by rejecting conventional systems. It suggested that identity and focus could substitute for scale, and that independence could be maintained without sacrificing profitability. But this interpretation depended on a critical assumption, that the conditions supporting this balance would remain unchanged. Because what looked like stability was, in reality, alignment. The company's success during this period relied on a specific combination of factors working simultaneously. Leadership remained consistent, preserving the direction established during its expansion. Demand within its niche market did not fluctuate significantly, allowing production to continue without major disruption. The factory operated without interruption, maintaining a steady output that matched its internal capacity. As long as these conditions held, the system appeared stable. But they were not guaranteed, they were variables. And none of them had been tested under significant pressure. This is the point where the narrative becomes more complex. Because TVR's peak was not just a result of strong products or clear identity, it was the result of a system functioning under ideal conditions, conditions that masked how dependent that system was on continuity. There were no large buffers built into the structure, no extensive frameworks designed to absorb sudden change. The company did not need them while everything was aligned, but that absence would become significant the moment any part of that alignment shifted. And during its peak, there was no immediate reason to expect that shift. The cars continued to sell. The brand continued to hold its position. The factory continued to produce at a consistent rate. From every visible angle, the system was working exactly as intended, which is why this period is often remembered as a success story. But success, in this case, did not necessarily mean resilience. Because a system can operate efficiently without being prepared for disruption, it can appear stable while depending on conditions that are temporary, and it can reach its highest point without addressing the limitations that only become visible under stress. That is what makes TVR's peak so deceptive in hindsight. Nothing about it clearly signaled an approaching collapse. There was no dramatic overexpansion, no visible financial breakdown, no immediate external force pushing the company toward failure. Instead, everything appeared to be under control, right up until the moment it wasn't. And that is where the illusion reaches its limit. Because if a company can grow, so you operate, and even dominate within its niche without relying on conventional systems, then the real test is not whether that model works under ideal conditions, but whether it can survive when those conditions begin to change. Chapter 4: Hidden Weaknesses. What makes TVR's collapse difficult to understand is that nothing appeared fundamentally broken until multiple failures began emerging at the same time. The weakness was never concentrated in a single decision, a single department, or a single moment. Instead, it was distributed across the system, developing quietly beneath years of apparent stability. And because each issue, in isolation, seemed manageable, none of them triggered immediate alarm. The first visible strain began to surface within the company's engineering decisions, particularly with the introduction of the Speed 6 engine. Designed in-house, it represented a natural extension of TVR's philosophy, independence, control, and the ability to define performance on its own terms. It allowed the company to avoid reliance on external suppliers and maintain full alignment between design and output. But that independence came with a cost that was not immediately visible. As production increased, what initially appeared as isolated reliability concerns began to develop into recurring problems. Engines required rebuilds, components failed earlier than expected, and warranty claims started to accumulate. These were no longer occasional issues that could be absorbed within normal operations. They became patterns. And once a problem becomes a pattern, it stops being technical and begins to become structural. The company was now absorbing the cost of those failures within a system that had never been designed to manage them at scale. There were no deeply embedded validation systems capable of identifying systemic faults before they reached the customer, and no large-scale testing frameworks that could prevent repetition. Problems were being addressed after they occurred, rather than being prevented at the source. As a result, each issue did not end with resolution, it carried forward into the next production cycle. At the same time, the financial impact of these issues did not arrive as a single visible shock. It accumulated gradually, spread across warranty costs, inefficiencies, and delays that were difficult to isolate within the company's existing structure. Without strong financial transparency or structured reporting systems, the true scale of this pressure remained partially obscured, even as it continued to grow. While engineering challenges were escalating, but the company's management structure was not evolving to contain them. Decision-making remained highly centralized, which allowed for speed but limited long-term strategic adaptation. There was no clearly defined framework for scaling operations, no structured plan for balancing innovation with reliability, and no system designed to stabilize the company as complexity increased. This created a critical imbalance within the organization, one that was not immediately visible but was already shaping its future. As ambition continued to grow through innovation and performance-driven design, the stability required to support that ambition did not develop alongside it. Over time, this gap widened, not through sudden failure, but through the gradual misalignment of systems that had once functioned in coordination. At the operational level, this imbalance became increasingly apparent within the production process itself. The handcrafted model, which had once been a defining strength, began to introduce variability that was difficult to control at higher volumes. Each vehicle depended on individual execution, meaning consistency was not embedded within the system, it had to be recreated with every build. While this approach remained effective at lower output levels, it introduced compounding pressure as production increased. Small inconsistencies required repeated adjustments, those adjustments reduced efficiency, and over time, those inefficiencies translated directly into cost. But cost was only one dimension of the problem. Variability also began to affect time, and time within a production system is far less flexible. Delays emerged not as isolated incidents, but as patterns. Without standardized processes or buffers to contain them, those delays spread across the system. One disruption affected the next stage of production, which in turn affected delivery timelines and ultimately customer confidence. As this process continued, multiple layers of the system began moving out of alignment simultaneously. Engineering challenges increased in frequency, operational consistency became harder to maintain, and financial pressure continued to build in response to both. Individually, none of these factors guaranteed collapse, but together, they created a system that was becoming progressively more fragile, less predictable, and increasingly difficult to control. Then, in 2004, that system was placed under a new condition. The acquisition of TVR by Russian investor Nikolai Smolensky was widely interpreted as an opportunity, an injection of capital, a shift in direction, and a pathway toward expansion. For a company that had operated independently for decades, this moment appeared to offer reinforcement rather than risk. But what it actually revealed was a structural mismatch between the company's internal system and the expectations of growth. Expansion requires more than resources. It requires systems capable of scaling, adapting, and absorbing change. TVR, however, had been built around continuity, familiarity, and a tightly interconnected internal structure that functioned most effectively under stable conditions. The introduction of new ownership disrupted that stability. It introduced new expectations without providing the structural depth required to support them. As a result, the weaknesses that had previously remained contained began to surface more aggressively. Engineering issues became harder to manage under increased expectations. Operational inefficiencies became more visible as consistency became more critical. Financial pressure intensified as the company attempted to adapt without the systems required to stabilize that transition. What had once functioned as a controlled environment was now being forced to respond to external pressure. And it was not designed to do so. From this point forward, recovery became structurally more difficult than failure. The system was no longer dealing with isolated problems that could be addressed independently. It was dealing with the interaction between those problems. Engineering issues increased costs, rising costs placed pressure on production pressure exposed operational limitations, and those limitations directly affected delivery and customer trust. Each weakness amplified the others, creating a chain reaction that moved through the entire organization. And once trust begins to erode within a system built on consistency and identity, it becomes one of the most difficult elements to restore. This is the moment where the narrative shifts. What had previously appeared as manageable challenges reveals itself as a connected system under strain. And a connected system does not fail in isolated parts, it fails as a whole. Which leads to the defining question of this chapter. Did the change in ownership create the crisis, Or did it simply force a system, already under pressure, to confront limits it had never been built to survive? Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. By the time TVR entered 2004, the conditions that had once supported its stability were already beginning to shift. The acquisition by Nikolai Smolensky did not immediately dismantle the company, but it introduced something the system had not been designed to handle: uncertainty. For decades, TVR had operated within a relatively consistent internal structure. Decisions, production, and identity were all aligned within a familiar framework. But ownership change disrupted that continuity. It introduced new expectations, new possibilities, and, more importantly, new variables that the company had never fully prepared for. At first, these changes were not clearly defined. Strategic direction became less certain, not because there was no vision, but because multiple directions began to exist at the same time. So there were discussions about restructuring, about expanding beyond the limitations of the existing system, and most significantly, about relocating production outside the United Kingdom. Individually, these ideas suggested growth, but collectively, they created instability. Because TVR's system depended on clarity. It relied on a shared understanding of how things worked, where production happened, how decisions were made, and what the company was trying to achieve. Once that clarity began to fragment, the effects were felt across every layer of the organization. Inside the Blackpool factory, uncertainty translated into hesitation. A workforce that had operated within a stable environment now faced questions about its future. If production were to move, what would happen to the people who carried the knowledge of the system? Or if direction changed, what would happen to the processes built over decades? This was not an immediate collapse of labor, but a gradual erosion of confidence. At the same time, suppliers began reacting to the same uncertainty. Relationships that depended on consistency and trust were now exposed to risk. If production volumes were no longer predictable, if timelines were no longer clear, then the entire supply chain became less stable. Delays began to emerge, not as isolated incidents, but as a reflection of growing hesitation across the network. And as these disruptions accumulated, financial pressure began to intensify. Costs that had once been manageable under stable conditions became more difficult to control when production slowed or became inconsistent. Technical issues, already present within the system, became harder to resolve within an environment that was no longer stable. Revenue, while not collapsing immediately, became less predictable. This is how the pressure built, not through a single failure, but through multiple systems losing alignment at the same time. Production itself began to feel the impact. Delays became more frequent, output became less consistent, and the rhythm that had once defined the factory started to break down. What had previously been a controlled process now required constant adjustment, and each adjustment introduced new inefficiencies. From the outside, these changes were not immediately visible. There was no single announcement that signaled collapse, but internally, the system was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. And then, the moment came when uncertainty turned into reality. The announcement of the Blackpool factory closure marked a shift that could no longer be contained within internal discussions. What had been speculation became confirmation. The physical center of the company, the place where its identity had been built and sustained, was no longer guaranteed to exist in its current form. This was not just an operational decision, it was a structural break. Because TVR was not a company that could easily separate its production from its identity. The factory was not just a location, it was the system itself. The people, the processes, the knowledge, all of it was embedded within that space. Once the possibility of closure became real, the effects accelerated. Workforce instability turned into departure. Employees who had once operated within a stable environment now faced uncertainty that could not be ignored. Some left by necessity, others by choice, but the result was the same: the gradual loss of the very expertise that held the system together. Suppliers, facing the same uncertainty, became less willing to commit. Delays increased. Coordination became more difficult. What had once been a functioning network began to fragment. And as these elements broke apart, production could no longer be sustained in the way it had been before. This is the point where the idea of recovery begins to weaken. Because recovery requires stability. It requires a system that, even under pressure, retains enough structure to rebuild. But TVR's structure was not designed for partial failure. It was designed for continuity. Once that continuity was broken, rebuilding became exponentially more difficult. What makes this phase critical is that the collapse still does not appear dramatic in a traditional sense. There is no single catastrophic event, no sudden financial crash that defines the moment. Instead, there is a gradual withdrawal of the elements that made the system function: people, coordination, confidence, and clarity. Each one on its own might have been recoverable, but together they created a condition where recovery required more than the company could provide. And this is where the illusion finally breaks. Because up until this point, it was still possible to believe that TVR could stabilize, that the disruptions were temporary, that the system could adjust and continue. But once production begins to slow in a system that depends on constant movement, the consequences are not linear, they accelerate. Delays lead to uncertainty. Uncertainty leads to withdrawal. Withdrawal leads to further delays. And the system begins to move in one direction, toward shutdown, which leads to the question that defines this turning point in the story. Once production begins to stop, is there any realistic path back? Chapter 6. Collapse in Motion. By the time TVR reached its final phase, the collapse was no longer a question of possibility. It had already begun to unfold. What remained was not whether the system would fail, but how that failure would move through the company and how much of it could survive the process. At first, the changes appeared gradual. Production slowed, not because demand had completely disappeared, but because the system that supported production was no longer functioning with the same continuity. Delays became more frequent. Coordination between departments weakened. What had once been a tightly connected process began to lose its internal rhythm. And then the consequences became visible. Workers began to leave. Some were laid off as production demands decreased, others chose to leave in response to growing uncertainty. And these were not easily replaceable roles. TVR's manufacturing process depended heavily on experience, on individuals who understood not just their specific task, but how that task connected to the rest of the system. As those individuals left, they did not just take labor with them. They took knowledge. Knowledge that had never been fully standardized, never fully documented, and never designed to be transferred at scale. It existed within the system, but not outside it. And once it began to disperse, it could not be easily reconstructed. Inside the factory, the impact was immediate. Processes that once flowed with familiarity now required adjustment. Tasks that had been routine became inconsistent. Small inefficiencies began to compound, not because the system had fundamentally changed, but because the people who sustained it were no longer there in the same capacity. At the same time, production itself became increasingly unstable. Orders that had already been placed could not be fulfilled within expected timelines. Some were delayed indefinitely. Others were left incomplete as the company struggled to maintain consistency in output. For customers, this marked a turning point. TVR's brand had always relied on trust, not in the conventional sense of reliability or predictability, but in the expectation that the company could deliver what it promised. That trust began to erode as delays extended and communication became less certain. And once that trust is disrupted, it does not return easily. Because in a niche market, where demand is driven by belief in the product as much as the product itself, a confidence is part of the system. When customers begin to doubt whether a company can deliver, that doubt becomes a form of pressure that the system must absorb. But by this stage, TVR's system was no longer capable of absorbing additional pressure. The factory, once defined by continuous activity, began transitioning into inactivity. Not abruptly, but progressively. Areas of production slowed, then stopped. The flow of materials is reduced. The movement that had once defined the space gave way to stillness, and with that stillness came finality. Because a production system is not just a physical space, it is a sequence of actions that must remain in motion to exist. Once that motion is interrupted for long enough, restarting it becomes increasingly difficult. This is what distinguishes collapse from disruption. One in a disruption can be corrected. A delay can be managed. But collapse occurs when the system loses the ability to restart itself, and that is what was happening inside TVR. The company had been built around a network of people, processes, and relationships that were tightly interconnected. It did not rely on external systems to maintain its structure, it relied on its own internal ecosystem. But that ecosystem was no longer intact. Workers had left, suppliers had become uncertain. Production had slowed to the point where continuity was no longer guaranteed. Each part of the system that weakened made it harder for the others to function. And without that interconnected support, the company could not operate in the way it once had. This is why the collapse cannot be understood purely as a business failure. It was the breakdown of an entire production ecosystem, one built on specialized labor, accumulated experience, and a way of working that could not be easily separated into independent parts. Once that ecosystem began to dissolve, the company lost more than its output. It lost its structure, and without structure, recovery is no longer a matter of decision. It becomes a matter of possibility. By the time production had effectively stopped, the question was no longer how to fix the system. It was whether the system, as it had existed, could ever be rebuilt. Because rebuilding would not require just restarting production. It would require reconstructing the network of knowledge, coordination, and trust that had defined the company at its peak. And that network no longer existed in one place. It had already begun to disperse. Which is why, see in the final stages of collapse, the most visible outcome, the silent factory, the halted production, the unfinished orders, is only part of the story. The deeper reality is less visible. It is the loss of continuity. The point at which a system no longer has the internal cohesion required to function, even if the external identity of the company still exists. And that leads to the final question of this phase, one that extends beyond TVR itself. If a brand depends more on the system that produces it than the name that represents it, then what actually remains when that system collapses? Chapter 7. What remained? After the collapse, what remained of TVR was not a clear ending, but a fragmented continuation of something that no longer operated as a complete system. The Blackpool factory, once defined by constant motion, gradually transitioned into inactivity. It did not disappear overnight, nor was it immediately replaced by something new. Instead, it became a space that still existed physically, but no longer functioned in the way it once had. The processes that defined it, the movement of materials, the coordination of skilled labor, the rhythm of production, were no longer present. What remained was structure without activity, form without function. And with that, the center of the company's identity was effectively gone. Ownership of the brand continued to shift in the years that followed. There were attempts to reposition TVR, to reintroduce it under different conditions, and to rebuild some form of production. On paper, the company still existed. The name had not disappeared, but continuity had already been broken. Because what defined TVR was not just the brand, but the system that supported it. That system could not be transferred as easily as ownership. It was not a set of assets that could simply be moved or replicated. It was a network of people, processes, and relationships that had developed over time within a specific environment. Once that environment was disrupted, the system began to disperse. The workforce was the first layer of that dispersion. Skilled workers who had spent years inside the factory, developing specialized knowledge tied directly to TVR's production methods, who were no longer part of a single organization. There was no structured transition that absorbed them into an equivalent system, no direct pathway that preserved the collective expertise in one place. Instead, that knowledge spread outward. Some moved into different industries, others left manufacturing entirely. What had once been a concentrated pool of experience became fragmented, existing in separate directions rather than as a unified whole. And once that fragmentation occurs, it becomes almost impossible to reverse. Because rebuilding the company would not simply require rehiring workers, it would require reconstructing the exact conditions under which that knowledge originally functioned, conditions that depended on continuity, familiarity, and time. At the same time, the brand itself continued to exist in a different form. Here, TVR remained recognizable. It retained its identity in the minds of enthusiasts, its reputation tied to the cars it had produced during its peak years. But recognition alone does not sustain a manufacturing company. Without consistent production, the brand becomes detached from the system that gave it meaning. It shifts from something active to something remembered. There were attempts to revive that activity, to reintroduce production, to bring the brand back into operation under new frameworks. But each attempt faced the same underlying challenge. The original system no longer existed. And without that system, any revival would not be a continuation, it would be a reconstruction. Something similar in name, but fundamentally different in structure. This is what defines the aftermath of TVR. Not a complete disappearance, it's but an incomplete presence. The company did not vanish entirely, but it also did not return in the form it once held. It remained in a state that was neither fully active nor fully gone, a brand with history but without the continuous system that had once sustained it. And this creates a different kind of absence. Not the absence of something that has ended, but the absence of something that can no longer exist in the same way again. Because industrial systems are not only defined by what they produce, but by how they produce it. The processes, the people, the environment, all of these elements combine to form something that cannot be easily separated into parts. Once that combination is broken, what remains is no longer the same system. It is something else, which leads to the final question of this phase. As if a company's legacy is built on a system that no longer exists, can that legacy truly survive in anything more than memory? Chapter 8. What this story actually means. What makes the collapse of TVR significant is not the scale of the company, but what it represents within a much larger pattern. On its own, TVR was a relatively small manufacturer operating within a niche segment of the automotive industry. Its production numbers were limited, its workforce was concentrated, and its market was specific. But the forces that shaped its rise and collapse were not unique to its size. They reflect a broader shift that has redefined how industrial systems function. For much of the 20th century, companies like TVR could exist within a space that balanced craftsmanship and independence. Manufacturing did not always require global scale, and smaller operations could survive by focusing on specialization, identity, and technical distinctiveness. In that environment, being different was not a disadvantage, it was a strategy. But that environment began to change. As the industry evolved, the requirements for survival became more complex. Engineering standards increased, regulatory pressures expanded, and the cost of maintaining competitive performance rose significantly. At the same time, global competition intensified, introducing manufacturers with greater resources, more advanced systems, and the ability to operate at scale without sacrificing consistency. Within this new structure, the gap between handcrafted production and scalable manufacturing became more difficult to manage. Handcrafted systems offer flexibility, individuality, and a direct connection between design and execution. But they also rely heavily on continuity, experience, and stability. They are efficient within a narrow range of conditions, but they struggle to adapt when those conditions shift. Scalable systems, by contrast, are designed for variation. They incorporate redundancy, standardization, and layers of control that allow them to absorb disruption. They may sacrifice some degree of individuality, but they gain resilience. TVR existed almost entirely within the first model. Its identity, its processes, and its structure were built around precision and independence. But independence in this context also meant isolation from the systems that could have stabilized it under pressure. When the environment changed, when technical challenges increased, when ownership shifted, when continuity was disrupted, the company did not have the structural depth required to adjust. And this is where the tension between ownership and identity becomes critical. A company can change ownership relatively quickly. Capital can be introduced, direction can be altered, and strategy can be redefined. But identity, especially one built over decades, cannot be adjusted at the same speed. It is embedded within the way a company operates, within the decisions it makes, and within the expectations of both its workforce and its customers. When those two forces move at different speeds, friction is inevitable. In the case of TVR, that friction exposed the limits of a system that had been designed for consistency, not transformation. The introduction of new expectations did not immediately strengthen the company. It revealed how dependent it was on the conditions that had originally allowed it to succeed. This is why the collapse should not be viewed as an isolated failure. It is part of a broader pattern in which independent engineering cultures, built on specialization and identity, struggle to survive within an industrial framework that increasingly rewards scale, integration, and adaptability. Some companies manage to transition. They evolve their systems, introduce new structures, and absorb the pressures of a changing environment. Others remain aligned with the principles that defined their success, but find those principles becoming harder to sustain over time. TVR represents the second path. It did not fail because its philosophy was incorrect. In many ways, that philosophy was the reason it existed at all. But the same principles that made it distinctive also limited its ability to adapt when the environment around it changed. And that is the central idea that extends beyond this one company. Industrial systems are not defined only by what they produce, but by how they are built to survive change. Some are designed for continuity, others are designed for adaptation. Very few can sustain both indefinitely. This story is not about how fast TVR's cars were, but about how long a system built on precision, independence, and risk can survive without the structure required to sustain it.